Hey, so this is my second video in my series talking about Star Trek Picard. My first video just basically introduced my background with Star Trek and why I found Picard to be so compelling, particularly season one. Now, starting with this video, I'm basically going to be watching through the series again, starting in season one, making a video for each episode, talking about some things that stand out in the episode to me, as well as occasionally pointing out things that might relate to my other interest areas, such as psychology, philosophy, spirituality, things like that. So this is going to be my fourth time watching season one, if I'm remembering right. Once I get to season two, that'll just be my second time because I've only seen that once. So first off, quick summary of Picard season one, episode one, Remembrance. There's the opening dream sequence between Picard and Data, pretty unforgettable. And then we're introduced to Picard and friends on the Vineyard before he nervously steps into what will become an emotionally charged interview. Then Daj gets a visit from some fellas in black, and after having some intuitional visions of Picard, she seeks out the famous guy she saw on TV. One thing leads to another. Daj is killed by the mysterious Romulans, but not before Picard figures out that she is a synth with some connection to Data. So he visits Agnes Jurati and finds out, so there's another one, because they're created in pairs. Which leads to the closing scene of the episode, which is when when we are shown Soji meeting Narek on the Borg cube. End of Picard season one, episode one, the first Star Trek pilot to not be a two-part episode, with the exception of the original series. I think the most important line in the episode is the one that appears near the beginning of the episode, and it could be argued to form something of a theme statement for the season. This is when Picard says to Data in his dream, "I don't want the game to end." And if I remember right, I'm pretty sure this phrase is repeated near the end of the season as well, suggesting that it's kind of this intentional marker for the beginning and the end of everything in between. You could say that the sentence suggests a story about end of life and old age, and thus the difference between aliveness and deadness. You could suggest as well kind of the end of life experience of having memories. I mean, the name of the episode, Remembrance, that end of life experience of having memories and also feeling this sense of loss. And maybe as well some interest in the search for meaning in life, which definitely is going to come up. And then by extension, you could say, if those things are pointed to directly by this theme statement, we could say by extension, they also indirectly relate to these other themes, which are going to become primary as the episode develops. The themes of human friendship, compassion and empathy, psychology, community, and most of all, trust. But they wasted no time in right away giving us this unforgettable one-liner that only Captain Picard could say right. As the episode continues and we begin to get to know Picard in this phase of life in his sunset years on his Vineyard, the personality differences from the Picard we knew before are instantly noticeable. Not only does he speak and walk more slowly because of his age, but in terms of personality and self-presentation, he now has these two favorite facial expressions, you could say, which were only extremely rare and forced back at the end of The Next Generation. Number one, his good-natured smile, which looks relaxed and authentic rather than forced. And then number two, this ubiquitous expression of understanding, or you could say empathy or warmth. Those really are his two most used expressions, at least as we see him, at this phase that I noticed. And then, of course, in addition to that change of personality, which we see by his preferred expressions, we also see he's a little different because at this point he's experiencing what Laris refers to as melancholy. I don't know if that's because, that's the British term for depression or what, but he's definitely experiencing that. And his body language conveys a tiredness and a weightiness that apparently comes from long years of disillusionment, disappointment, and being really tired of living. Something else that stood out to me in this rewatch of episode one, I could have said this the first time I watched it. In many of Picard's early interactions with Daj after she seeks him out and comes to him on his Vineyard, as he reacts to her, he's reacting to this very unusual experience, and it's right after his own negative experience with the interview. And it seems like everything he says and does is really perfect. For example, when she asks if he believes her, and he says in the most reassuring voice on earth, he says, "I believe that you believe you're supposed to be here." And he just hits the nail on the head, 6,000%, every single thing that comes out of his mouth. Seems to me that for anyone creating fiction, there's a bit of a catch-22 in terms of the dilemma of whether to make characters that are real, flawed, always saying unhelpful things, or characters that are kind of examples to follow. For an extreme example of the former, think of Carter from Eureka. He always misses the opportunity to say things he needs to say because maybe he's too nervous or his mind goes blank or he can't find the words. But he's relatable because that's how people actually are. Picard in this series, on the other hand, is so interpersonally skilled, compassionate, sensitive, and perceptive that he's really the other extreme of that. He's not one drop of the everyman in terms of relational skills, but instead someone to admire and an example to aspire to. And that's not a criticism. It's something I love about the show because we all need larger than life role models once in a while. And the end result with this show just feels really satisfying to watch. His lines of dialogue aren't the intentionally messy ones that the writer would deviously scribble down as he writes for this hapless character, but instead the expertly crafted lines that the writer perhaps wishes so badly that he would be able to say in his own real life, For an interesting counterexample, think about the TNG Season 7 episode Bloodlines, in which Picard finds a young man who may be his son. We do eventually find out that he's not his son, but in the meanwhile, we get to see Picard trying really hard to step into the role of father figure, and things just keep landing wrong. The climax comes when Picard finally manages to have a conversation with him, a real, meaningful conversation. And as we watch it, we're so afraid it will go badly, so much so that it feels really good when it doesn't go badly and they actually connect. That version of Picard told Crusher that he doesn't have a clue about the role of father figure and what that would mean and how to do it. And his discomfort, it shows through in his interactions. He's relatable and flawed, so we hold our breath and we root for him. But in Star Trek Picard, we don't hold our breath in the same way because this venerable old man has become a relational master, the perfect and flawless old grandfather who we keep on admiring, even though he's got this grouchiness simmering under the surface. This leads me to another observation about Picard. I think more so than any other Star Trek, Season 1 of Picard and its pilot episode, Remembrance, really intend to be a human interest story with its focus set on compassion, trust, intuition, and the search for meaning in life. The main stuff of this episode are made out of the expressions of the characters and the carefully refined dialogue. The plot elements and sci-fi stuff don't get nearly the same amount of screen time or focus, which is perhaps why it's criticized. Maybe it's criticized primarily by those who are more interested in seeing the development of intriguing plot twists, canon references, and sci-fi mysteries, rather than in watching a human interest story that is dripping in relationship and psychology. Meaning of life also seems to be a significant part of the Season 1 themes that are being introduced in this episode here. You remember Daj questioning if there can be meaning in life if she's just a synthetic rather than a normal person. Picard insists that there is meaning in life, that there is meaning for her in having been lovingly created. And he adds that Daj reminds him of Data, who was all meaning, all, and I forget the rest of the quote, but I remember all meaning. And then he said some other very positive, very meaningful things about how Data is a person. And then for this theme, it's just one scene later, Picard expresses the meaninglessness of his own elderly life, living in isolation, writing history books that most people would prefer to forget. And he says, I haven't been living, I've been waiting to die. It seems that Picard's principal problem in his phase of life wasn't his melancholy, Laris's word for his depression, which she makes that reference after he says it's not the dreams that are the problem, but it's waking up that's the problem. But it seems that Picard's problem in this phase of life, it wasn't his melancholy, it wasn't his regrets, it wasn't his bitterness, it was his lack of meaning in life. Hence, his preference in this particular scene to set off and try to accomplish something worth living for, even though it's very much not fitting for somebody his age. As I see it, it's such a powerful and perceptive story element to put in there because the fact of the matter is that perceived lack of meaning in life very often results in symptoms that are indistinguishable from depression and can even be mistaken for the symptoms of old age itself. Picard finds out there's a difference between being alive and waiting to die. In a similar vein, I was instantly appreciative of this kind of soft retcon they did to increase, as I see it, this is how I interpret it at least, kind of a soft retcon they did to increase the sense of the meaningfulness of conscious life by making it a little more rare, a little more special. Girardi tells us that sentient androids weren't likely to be developed by Starfleet for the next 1,000 years. And then we gradually find out that these synths that are running around, like Daj and Soji, the way they were made was by using a little bit of data, a little bit of another living person. To me, this is an improvement from the mindset in Voyager and TNG, where in that world, an accidental touch of a button could make a hologram, basically an NPC from your favorite video game. You know, you accidentally touch the wrong button and it becomes conscious, just like you. You know, to me, I actually think that was one of the weak points of 90s Trek. This aspect of the ubiquity of conscious and sentient AI. For me, it always requires a heavy suspension of disbelief. Now in Picard, I still have to practice, like with all TV, and especially sci-fi. Of course, I have to practice some suspension of disbelief on subjects like that. But I feel like I'm like they're giving us a lot more respect for humanity in how they're treating that here. They present Data as a one-of-a-kind living being who no one has been able to copy. They couldn't make another one just like him. In contrast to how the Doctor was treated on Voyager, where the backup module of the Doctor that was never supposed to be turned on can get turned on thousands of years later, and he can have his own life independent of the real Doctor, whichever one was the real one, you know. And the last theme I want to mention is the theme of trust, which I think is one of the big themes in season 1. And it comes out vividly in this episode by these two story threads that kind of run parallel almost. Of course, they're not at the same time, but they're parallel in the sense that they're still similar. First one that stands out to me is Daj's, these scenes where Daj shows this unreserved intuitional trust in Picard. And then on the other hand, Soji's similar unreserved intuitional trust in Narek, which of course that's later, but it's foreshadowed in the very final scene of this episode. That first one, Daj's trust, is triggered by a state of desperation, that state that we experience when the need for reaching out in trust is, we're going to feel that most deeply. The other one, Soji's, is triggered during the calm of comfortable moments, that state we experience when we feel the least fear of harm or danger. And both of those are vividly expressed by the actress in her nonverbals. Soji's future relationship with Narek is foreshadowed in this episode by her warm and almost intimate response to Narek's feigned discomfort when he pretends to have some sad thing he doesn't want to share with her. And it's hard to tell how much of her reaction comes from her character's compassion instinct, which she would express to everyone and anyone who said anything sad, or how much it relates to the flirtation impulse, which clearly was there. Or more likely, if the two were working together along with her innocence and vulnerability, and you have all four kind of coming together. We know in later episodes, Soji tells Narek that she's aware that she's got this thing where she just trusts people way too easily, and she knows that's a problem, something that many of us can relate to. In this scene, knowing that and looking at this scene, to me, it's almost like that moment. There's this moment when you see her eyes kind of soften. And it's almost like you can sense that at that very moment, suddenly she's transitioned completely into trust and emotional openness, all because of a positive first impression and a little bit of fishing for compassion on his part. In both cases, the case of Daj and the case of Soji, this kind of accelerated and highly intimate kind of trust, it comes because of intense intuitions. In the one case, for Daj, it's because she's so desperate that she needs someone, and she's having these intuitional visions of Picard. In the other case, it's the impulses related to attraction, accompanied by Narek's charm and her own inner sense that he's somebody she can trust. So, wrapping things up a bit. End of life, meaning in life, relational trust. In a world in which we long for meaning in life, and in which relationships and compassion are something that's in view. There's nothing more necessary than trust. But what do we lean on to guide our trust? While you could suggest that the fatal flaw in Dodge/Soji was her accelerated pursuit of trusting others, it can also be pointed out that in television and film, everything is always accelerated. So I wonder if maybe these aren't intended to show the hazard of accelerated emotional intimacy, but instead to paint the contrast of the beauty and the tragedy of human trust, when there's nothing we need more deeply, but we can't seem to infallibly select the trustworthy. Next video in the series, I'll talk about some thoughts on season 1, episode 2 of Picard. See you then.